I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. I once knew someone who tried this. What worked for me is, I have a friend and this is all she did. These are phrases that are often the beginning of an anecdote. Anecdotal meaning that someone is sharing their experience and someone is sharing what happened to them with respect to their journey and positioning it in a way that makes you wonder whether or not it's something you should do too. Today we're going to talk about some of the challenges of what we call anecdotal evidence or anecdotes, and why I believe that anecdotal evidence has started to take over as being one of the primary ways that people make decisions about their medical care. And yet, more often than not, it's probably steering you in the wrong direction. I'm all for experience. I'm all for people having, especially clinicians, a long history of interacting with a particular kind of patient or a particular challenge and using their experience as a share moment with other people who might be having the same experience to help them reflect on, how their experience may relate to yours and then how you might use that information to move yourself forward. That's not really what I'm talking about today. We're talking about when someone's story becomes the truth, when someone positions their experience as what your experience will be like as well, or when we start to make decisions based on anecdotes. And I want you to be able to dissect this sort of cognitive bias that we end up with when we hear anecdotes so that you can feel it in yourself when you're starting to make decisions based on what someone else's experience has actually been, rather than maybe what the more logical or more obvious answer is. So what do I mean by anecdotal evidence? Now, in medicine, we actually have sort of a hierarchy of how we think about evidence. And this does vary from discipline to discipline. So the evidence that we use in nutrition has to be a little different than the evidence that we use, say, in a drug trial, just because the interventions are different and the way that we get participants or subjects in a study to do things is also different. But we kind of have a hierarchy of how we'd like to think about whether or not something is true. And I think if I asked you, how would you know if a fact is true? You probably would have some very similar thoughts as to the way we think about research, truly. You'd be like, well, I'd like it to be something that's been proven multiple times. I'd like it to be something that maybe different people have proven, so we don't get like one guy's opinion on it. We'd want to see that lots of people kind of thought the same thing. We'd maybe want to see this thought challenged in a few different ways, and yet we still kind of always come out with the same answer. We maybe would want it to be true in multiple circumstances. So is it true over here and it's true over there? Is it true in North America and it's also true in Europe, right? We would want to see that some of those challenges, we still hold up that truth, whatever that answer kind of is. And in medical research, we kind of want the same things, really. We want to know that the answer that we're getting out of a study is repeatable, that it's generalizable, or that at least we've been really clear about who it works in and who it doesn't. We've had multiple people look at it from multiple angles over multiple years, and we always seem to come up with the same answer, right? That's what makes something truer in science. And remembering that we're always working towards truth, we don't actually ever know the truth in science, which is why we change our mind in medicine, which I know is frustrating as a patient. But really, it's towards this like evolving movement towards truth. We don't ever say that something is for sure. That's actually a great red flag. If you're online and someone says something for sure, you know that they're actually not practicing great science, because we never say that in science. So what's the issue with anecdotes? So when we research something, we design studies to try and compare, people and their experience, and then we use that information to try and make a decision about what might happen to you. So for example, if I took a group of people that, had blue hair and who had a body weight of X and who, came from a particular ethnic background and had a particular education that was different than yours, and said, these people should sleep until 8:30 a.m. Immediately, you would start to think, well, I don't have blue hair. I mean, maybe you do, but you may say, I don't have blue hair. I'm not from that particular ethnic origin. I don't have that kind of education. Am I supposed to sleep that late? So when we design a study, we're actually trying to collect people kind of like you, or we want them to be close enough to you that we can say, you know what, she can do the same thing. These people are close enough to her that we could probably guess that they're going to have the same experience from a treatment or from a solution, because they're close enough to being similar. But this is why we don't always borrow data on men for women. This is why we don't always borrow data on adults for children. This is why we can't always borrow data on adults for pregnant people. Right? We need the study design to actually be close enough to you that it's worthy of us borrowing the information to talk about you. Because otherwise you would see that there's a huge problem, right? If we're talking about testosterone levels in someone that was assigned male at birth and you who weren't, we would go, no, that you guys are too different. We can't actually look across those two people and say they're going to end up the same if we do the same thing. You would never adopt the same solution as that person. You're too different. But then your coworker sits down beside you and is like, you know what's worked great for me? Intermittent fasting. Are we applying the same sort of stringent thoughts and the same critical appraisal when Karen says she's intermittent fasting as if I said, we're going to borrow this data from men and use it on you? Right? You'd be like, well, no, I'm not a man, so I don't want to use that information. But you're also not Karen. And yet, when we have discourse around health, we're much more likely to see that person who's in front of you as being way more similar to you than you would for some of my examples I just gave there, like on paper. Right? If you were reading a book and the title was, "This is not for you," right? You would like very easily be able to read what the book said to do and be like, yeah, it's not for me. That's what the title says. It's not for me. And yet, when your coworker pulls out their lunch and they've had success with their health or whatever it is, for some reason we start to see ourselves more closely to that person when the title of their book probably also is, "This is not for you," right? This is working for them, but it's not working for you. So in an anecdote, we make a mistake where we assume that our experience is going to be the same as the person we're getting the anecdote from because we feel more connected to their story, when there's actually probably things about them or about their journey, and we'll get into it in a second, but just from a very high level perspective, there are things about them that are dissimilar to you. And when they share their story of success, or their doctor's like, I one time had this patient and they did brilliantly with blah treatment plan, are we the same as them? Are we? Because when we make decisions, especially in medicine, that's what we want to know. That we want to know that the study was on you and that you're going to respond the same. But an anecdote kind of skips over that. And often like the way that we get that information and where we hear it changes our ability to think about that piece really critically, right? If a family member says, you should do this because I did it and it was great, right? Ooh, that's really close to us. And maybe we do imagine we're kind of the same as them, but you're probably not. Or a coworker, right? You're close enough. You spend a lot of time together. Maybe you are similar, but you're probably not. Or even when your doctor shares a story about one person who did great doing X. Now a person in power is actually saying that you should maybe do this. And so maybe we start to feel a bit more connected to that idea, but should we? So our first issue, and we're actually going to go through a few issues with anecdotes. The first issue is that you are not the same as the person in the story. You are not the same as the person in the anecdote. And yet, because of the way that anecdotes are often delivered, they're delivered with emotion and connection. And maybe the person who's sharing it with you deeply loves you and wants you to get better. We start to not have this ability to appraise that information and say, well, am I like that person? Can I do the same as them? Can I respond to the same as them? It's harder because of the way the information is presented. Right? If you read a newspaper article about one woman who miraculously solved all her problems, you would feel a little bit more disconnected from that. You might still go, ooh, that's interesting. Maybe I should try that. Right? We've all seen that person on Oprah who did the amazing health journey, and we want to feel and be like them. And so we listen to their story and maybe adopt it. But when it's shared with you one-on-one, like as most anecdotes are, then that really is going to make it difficult for you to say, am I like this? But that really is kind of step one in trying to understand if an anecdotal share is actually something that is helpful for you. Am I like this? And sometimes I think when patients have unique medical circumstances or have suffered from a very unique situation in their life, we start to view you as being very, very different from the average population. And I think we make this mistake in medicine all the time. I've had this conversation with colleagues where when people are unique or have a chronic disease, we actually start to use anecdotes to treat you more often because we start to imagine that you're not the same as everybody else when you actually might be. Right? Or in lots of circumstances, you might be the same as everyone else. Even if you have a chronic disease, we probably should treat your perimenopause the same as we treat everybody's perimenopause. But sometimes when we start to view things as this unique circumstance, we're willing to get away from good practice and decision making and actually make decisions based on anecdotes. So that's the first issue. So when someone's sharing a story with you, and now you're going to think about this, especially after the holiday season and people are new year, new them. But just because it's new them doesn't mean it can be new you. And so as someone's sharing a story about this one time at band camp, I want you to think am I there? Am I at band camp? Am I that person? Am I going to benefit from this same solution that they benefited from? That's the first question I want you to ask yourself. The second challenge with anecdotes is how significantly they play on some of our cognitive biases. So we're all biased, right? We're all influenced by our upbringing, by our community, right? We're influenced by some of our automatic thought patterns. We're all biased. Good decision making probably requires us to be able to sort of hold our biases out in front of us and at least acknowledge them, rather than sort of moving blindly through decision making and not even realizing how much some of our biases are actually playing a role on our decision making. So there's lots of cognitive distortions and cognitive biases. I'm going to pick on a couple that sort of relate to this anecdotal piece. When you're presented with a problem, and I'm going to use some specific examples so that it's helpful for you. Let's think about hormone replacement therapy, right? If you're part of our audience who's, about to hit menopause or in that perimenopausal window, this is going to be a decision you're going to have to make at some point in time, is thinking about hormone replacement therapy. Now, as soon as I say those words, you probably have some ideas, right? You might be thinking about the first memory you have of HRT, which might be, if you're in that sort of 40 to 55-year-old range, that might be when your mother was told that she was going to be killed by her HRT in the 90s and she stopped taking it. What's your first memory of that conversation? Was it positive? Was it negative? Because there's actually a bias where the very first thing we ever heard about something is the thing that we sort of anchor to and start to make decisions based on, even if that information was 100% false. And so that first exposure or experience, especially if it came from someone we trust or an authority figure, is really going to influence any other information you ever receive about something. And you probably have faced this in other areas, right? Where you were introduced to someone as them being mean, right? Your coworker was like, oh, here's the new girl, she's mean. Think about how long it took for you to get rid of that bias that she was mean. And maybe you never did. Maybe you're like, yeah, she's nice, but she's also mean. Right? We carry around that very first impression that we ever heard about anything for a long time. And I struggle with this in practice because, my experience with patients is long, right? I get a minimum of 75 minutes in a first interaction with someone when we're talking about their hormone experience and their goals and their values and their menopause. And then they'll reference a 2-minute interaction they had once with someone who one time did an ultrasound of their breast, who was not qualified to even say the sentence they said. And that person who did their ultrasound said, "This spot on your breast is sensitive to hormones." And my patient has anchored all of their thoughts about their future to this one sentence because it's the first time that anyone had ever made a comment about their breasts and their hormones. And that comment is meaningless. Lots of your breast tissue is sensitive to hormones. That's what they do, right? However, they then struggle to make a decision based on any other information that's ever given to them after that one reference point. Or if a patient escorts a family member to their chemotherapy, they may have a casual experience with an oncologist who turns to them and says, you're going to want to think about your hormones because you might be at risk for breast cancer. You know what? We are all at risk for breast cancer. But that casual 20-second interaction can lay the groundwork for a bias that then prevents people from making other decisions later in life. Or maybe you've been told that you have a family history of something. Is it true? Did they use the right way to even measure that if you have a family history of something, and yet are you carrying it around like kind of a negative badge of honor that you might have a heart attack one day? Right? Remember, think back. Think of some of those things that you carry around specifically with your health. But even, this is a great exercise to do with people and other opinions, maybe special interest groups. Things that you're carrying around that was maybe your first experience or first impression of that thing that you actually have not let go, even though maybe you've been presented with other information. Just imagine if someone's very first exposure to HRT was an unbiased representation of the data that showed the positives versus the negatives and framed that, honestly, the majority of people can safely take HRT and actually have a reduction in risk of lots of diseases. And yet, that's not your memory. So the challenge with anecdotes is that sometimes becomes our first memory of something, right? Or you'll reflect on someone else's experience, which maybe it's the first time you heard of an app or a weight loss program or a supplement, and you've anchored yourself to that idea. Someone randomly told you that creatine made them gain weight, and now you're afraid to take it, when that's not actually true. And yet, as a practitioner, it's impossible to undo that cognitive bias. You've anchored yourself to that information, and there's nothing I could say that would actually change your mind. So that's one of the challenges with anecdotes. The other challenge is, think about the person who's giving you the anecdote. They're also biased, right? Maybe it was their first experience, and now they're really rooted to that, and they're going to share it with you, and now it's your first experience, and now you're both doomed. Now neither of you are going to take creatine. And you probably should. So that's one of the cognitive biases that influences our ability to make decisions, is that we just get anchored. one of the others is that it's often a confirmation of something we already believe. So another sort of cognitive distortion is confirmation bias. And what that means is that it's information that's confirming something you already think. So what you think might be wrong, what they said might be wrong, but when we put the two together, you actually start to weigh it as a 1 + 1 = 100%. We are totally right. And confirmation bias is everywhere, honestly. Think even about your news feed. Your news feed of your social media probably confirms things you already like or already do, right? The information we're exposed to, the people we hang out with. And in some ways, it's like validation is good. I'm not saying validation isn't good. There's a huge difference between you being emotionally validated and supported by the people around you and the things you expose yourself to. But when we're trying to make a decision and all you've done is wrap yourself in a bubble of people who think like you and do like you, what if you're wrong? So confirmation bias is tough. It's hard to unravel because part of the challenge is that we actually start to actively seek out information that confirms what we think, and we refute information that is the oppositional. So for example, if you come across a friend who says something that is oppositional to what you think, you automatically in your mind start to make up a reason why she's wrong. Yeah, well, she went to that school, or she came from that company, or that's been her experience, but that's not correct, right? Rather than just seeing it for face value, right? We automatically, if it contrasts what we already think, we automatically in our head come up with a list of reasons why they are wrong. We don't come up with a list of reasons why we are wrong, ever, right? Not naturally. And so, yes, confirmation bias is an issue because what we're exposed to, etc., is confirming what we already think. But in addition to that, new information that comes in, we can't accept it. Right? If it's not confirming what we already think, we naturally create a top 10 reasons why you're wrong list, and we stick to our guns. I mean, even think about you interacting with reviews on something, right? Think about if there was a restaurant that you loved and you started reading the reviews and there was a bad review, you'd be like, oh, that person is high maintenance. They didn't like the service. You know what? They're probably rude, right? But if it's a restaurant you're not sure about, you're like, I don't know if I want to go there. Let's read the reviews. The service was terrible. I knew it. And we kind of do the same thing when we make decisions in medicine. And so where anecdotes come in is the people you surround yourself with are often going to give you anecdotes that you kind of already connect with. And it's going to make you feel like they're truer because they're people that are already connected to you, right? So the people in your family, the people, you're going to see their anecdotes as being connected to you because they're probably not saying something so rashly different than what you already believed. You're already in the same circle. And so now we're taking their story, which I just said in the last section might be wrong and you're not like them. And yet it's confirming kind of what we already think culturally. And so we're way more likely to believe it. Whereas when someone comes in with different information, maybe you go to a medical appointment and the receptionist is a bit cold. The office has the air conditioning set a little too low. You couldn't find parking, so you were a couple minutes late. You get into the appointment and the doctor says something different than what you were expecting. You're actually not that likely to do it, right? You're not that likely to do it. But if you go into the office and the receptionist actually looks like you and they're playing your favorite song on Spotify and the Christmas ornaments that they have at the front desk are the same ones that you have at home, and the doctor is the same height as you and takes you into the office and has a painting by the person that you know locally as a great artist, and they say something, you believe it. And there's actually studies on this, which is fascinating. But you're more likely to do it. And so confirmation bias is when we start to collect information that is confirming the thing we already think and already believe. And if you're having a good experience and a positive experience, it's more likely to align with what you do. Whereas when something comes in sideways, or it feels like it comes in sideways, that doesn't confirm what you already think, you have a harder time examining your position and a very easy time examining theirs. Which is tough, right? Because what if the person's coming in with like a revolutionary idea? We miss it. We miss the opportunity. And the last thing that I want to say about anecdotal evidence, as we're really breaking down some cognitive distortions today, which I feel like is fun. I always thought that this was one of the things that made me a great clinician, is that I really friggin' love this mental gymnastics of decision making. It's actually one of the things I think that I bring to the table when I talk to clinicians about practice and evidence, is the mental gymnastics of clinical decision making, and how do we make good decisions, and how do we communicate what decisions we want to offer to patients, or what solutions we want to offer to patients to help them make a decision. I find this fascinating, and this is totally an overlooked area in medicine, right? Most doctors are like, well, there is only one answer, and it's the answer that I said, which is not really how conversations go. But I find this fascinating. But the last thing I want you to take away from is that one of the biggest challenges we have with anecdotal evidence is that we're often wrong when we think about causality. We're often wrong when we make associations between things. And yet, again, that's not how anecdotal evidence is presented. So let me give you an example. If you meet with your coworker, Karen, over lunch, and she starts talking about her amazing weight loss journey, and she says it's all because of her intermittent fasting, how do we know that that's the right thing that we've attributed Karen's success to? That's what she thinks. Does she even know enough to know what is causing her miraculous weight loss? Is it the intermittent fasting? Is it that intermittent fasting got rid of her nighttime binge eating? Is it that intermittent fasting actually made her pack her lunch every day? Is it that intermittent fasting actually helped her find time to go to the gym? Is it that not eating so close to bedtime actually gave her better sleep, and so she has better energy, so she's actually doing more steps? Maybe it's not the intermittent fasting at all. But because we generally have a hard time making a connection between causality or causation or even association, the story gets told in the way that the teller believes things are connected. But usually we're wrong. We're usually wrong. And now they've presented you with an idea that actually isn't connected to their success at all. Now, in research studies, we absolutely do our best to try and get away from this, right? And, we can poo-poo certain aspects of research because research isn't perfect. 100% research is not perfect. However, when we run a really great research trial, we try our best to get rid of all of those confounding things that might have given us the result instead. So if we're going to do a study on intermittent fasting, we track their steps to make sure that doesn't change. If we're going to do intermittent fasting, we keep their calories the same, right? We don't let them just cut out 300 calories because that wouldn't help us understand things. If we're going to do a study on intermittent fasting, we take out people out of the study that maybe are going to screw up the results. So that hopefully when we say, this is what we think at the end, we've done our very best to eliminate some of those confounding variables. But in an anecdote or a story, that's not what we get, right? We get someone's personal affliction towards a solution told with romance and excitement. There's a villain, there's a hero. But what if we're wrong? What if we have the characters like all wrong? So the challenge with anecdotes is that we have a really hard time attributing results to a particular action, and yet that's how they get phrased, right? The punchline is, you should do this because I did this. You should do this because Aunt Mary did this. You should do this because my patient did this and they got better. So thinking back over the course of the episode, There were kind of 3 things I wanted you to take away from this, which I didn't really state explicitly at the beginning. 3 ways to throw anecdotal evidence in the trash. But the first thing is I want you to think really deeply when someone shares a story about whether or not you're close enough to them that the results will be the same for you as it was for them. Because it might not be. And that's okay. Right? Well-conducted research, we actually are trying to research you. And so you need to think about that deeply. Are you the same as the person telling the story? Or the same as the patient that your doctor's talking about? Number 2 is, how do our cognitive biases play into how we make decisions? Because anecdotes are romantic. It's amazing. Like I said, villain, hero, right? There's a battle, we win. And so our cognitive distortions and the way that we get either anchored to information, the way we bias, the way we collect information, the stories we're even willing to listen to and the stories we're not willing to listen to. If you already had a negative taste in your mouth about something and you read the reviews on it, you're definitely not going to do it, right? The anecdotes play into that because they are romantic stories of success. And they may be confirming something you already believe. Maybe you just aren't trying hard enough, right? Karen did it. You can do it. But what if that's not true? And are you willing to put down your beliefs for a minute and examine all the information in front of you in a very, very, very pragmatic, logical way? It's hard. And that's often when we need a coach to reflect back to us and say, yo, you know that this study over here actually says you're wrong about what you're noticing. Are you willing to try something else on? Right? That's where we often need support. And the last one is that we have to make sure that we're not attributing success to something that is actually unrelated, right? Which is impossible. It's really hard. We like to think that the hero defeated the villain with a sword. But what if it wasn't the sword, right? What if it was that it was like, I don't know, something else? I got into that story metaphor and then I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. But you know what I'm saying, right? We can't attribute the success of a person often to the thing that we've nailed down as being the reason why they're successful, especially in a story, because there's so much of the story you're not hearing. There's so much of the story, right? Maybe Karen's in a new relationship, right? We don't get that part of the story. We heard about her intermittent fasting. And so I want you to be able to think about those 3 things when someone's sharing a story with you. And this is a time of year where you get a lot of stories about how to be successful. And you really need to think, are you the same as them? Are my currently held beliefs actually getting in the way of me hearing this story for what it is? And are any of us able to tease out what actually made this person's story successful? Or are we attributing it to the wrong thing? I said at the beginning that anecdotal evidence can be powerful. Every time I talk about anecdotal evidence, I will get practitioners and doctors coming forward and saying, you're saying my clinical experience is worthless. Like, no. All I'm saying, though, is that your clinical experience can't get in the way of us learning new research. It can't get in the way of us still comparing whether the patient in front of us is the same as the patients we've treated in the past. We still have to examine our biases daily as a practitioner. And we still have to be sure that we've actually attributed the success of our patient to the thing that we did and not something else, right? The rules still apply. But if you're struggling, especially with something that feels unique or complex, and you see someone who's treated thousands of people like you, and they have a cool way of supporting you, great, that's great. There's actually nothing wrong with that. But where we put anecdotal evidence in the hierarchy of how we make decisions on the general public scale is way higher than it should be. And I just want you to have the tools to actually be able to break it down and make sure that you're making the right decisions for you based on your needs. See you next week. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.